You may not yet realize it. But the moment an empath stops overgiving is not merely an act of restraint, it is a psychic event, a reorganization of the inner world, a shift in the axis around which the entire personality revolves. I want you to imagine for a moment that your generosity, your sensitivity, your orientation toward others has always been like a river that refuses to consider its own banks. It spills, it floods, it nourishes, but it also erodes. And there comes a moment in the life of the empath when the river must discover its own boundary, not because it wishes to deny its nature, but because without that boundary, the current loses direction, clarity, and power. As I speak to you, I want you to feel the subtle stirring in your chest, that quiet recognition that you have lived much of your life giving as though giving itself were your identity. For the empath, overgiving is rarely an act of ego. It is often a survival strategy born long ago, arising from a childhood psychic landscape in which approval meant safety and attunement meant belonging. Many of you learned that if you did not give enough emotionally, energetically, psychologically, then you would somehow lose connection, love, or harmony. And so you began to overfunction, to anticipate needs, to soothe others, to hold the storm of another's emotion, as if it were your natural duty. You must understand that such tendencies do not emerge from weakness, but from a profound attunement to the emotional field around you. Empaths are not manufactured. They are formed in the fire of early relational patterns, in the subtle exchanges between the child's fragile psychic body and the vast, unpredictable world of the parent's unconscious. In many cases, the child senses the parent's unmet needs as if they were their own, and without any conscious choice, the child becomes the caretaker of the parent's inner chaos. This is the origin of overgiving. It is a learned myth that says, if I can regulate their emotions, I will finally be safe. But the psyche keeps a perfect record of every imbalance. Every time you overextend, every time you suppress your own needs in order to maintain peace, every time you carry another person's emotional burden as though it were your ancestral duty, the self watches, the self, the organizing, regulating, truth-seeking center of your being will not tolerate a life built solely on compensation. It allows imbalance for a time, but eventually it sends signals in the form of exhaustion, resentment, inner collapse, intuitive dissonance, and even physical symptoms. These signals are not punishments, they are invitations, invitations to return to the center, to the axis mundi of your own psychological existence. When an empath stops overgiving, what truly occurs is a reintegration of the shadow, for overgiving is often the mask worn by a disowned part of the personality. Somewhere deep inside, the shadow holds all the unmet needs, the silenced desires, the anger swallowed for the sake of peace, the exhaustion hidden beneath the smiling face. And when the empath finally says enough, that voice does not arise from the surface personality, it emerges from the shadow, from the forgotten regions of the psyche that have long waited for acknowledgement. This is why the moment of stopping feels so powerful, so instantaneous. The psyche is reclaiming something that has always been its own. Let me share with you an image, as I often do when I work with patients in active imagination. Imagine a dream in which you stand before a vast altar. On this altar, there is a bowl filled with water. Every time you give too much, a drop of water falls out. You have done this for years, perhaps decades, and the bowl is nearly empty, but suddenly, in the dream, a figure appears behind you, perhaps a wise old man, perhaps a motherly figure, perhaps a version of yourself you barely recognize, and this figure places their hand over the bowl. You notice something remarkable. The water begins to rise again, not because you are pouring anything into it, but because the bowl itself has remembered how to replenish. This is the nature of the inner restoration that occurs when overgiving ends. The psyche has its own mechanisms of renewal, but they can only activate when you cease leaking your essence into places where it does not belong. Overgiving, you see, is not merely behavioral. It is symbolic. It is a psychological posture in which the ego attempts to compensate for a perceived internal deficiency by giving excessively to the external world. The empath gives because they unconsciously believe they are responsible for the emotional climate of their relationships. They give because they fear what might arise if they do not. They give because silence used to mean danger. They give because withholding once meant abandonment. They give because they have confused love with self-erasure. But I tell you today, balance is not achieved through self-sacrifice. It is achieved through self-recognition. There is a moment in the individuation process when the empath feels the tectonic plates of their inner world shift. Suddenly, they realize that the emotional states of others do not belong to them. They realize that empathy without boundaries becomes martyrdom. They realize that compassion without self-awareness becomes codependency. They realize that giving without reciprocity becomes psychic theft, self-theft. This moment of realization is what restores balance instantly. It is not gradual, though the healing afterward may take time. The insight itself comes with the suddenness of a revelation, as though a veil has been lifted from the eyes of the soul. I have seen this happen in patients many times. They walk into my office burdened and depleted, believing they are kind, caring, and spiritually evolved, and indeed they are, but they are also unconscious of the shadow that drives their generosity. When the shadow is revealed, when they see the fear beneath the giving, the wound beneath the selflessness, the entire structure of their relational life shifts. Let me take you deeper into the archetypal layer. For the empath is not merely a psychological type, but an archetypal pattern. The empath resembles the wounded healer, the individual who attempts to heal others in order to avoid confronting their own wound. This archetype is ancient, found in every mythology, every culture, every symbolic system. The healer who gives too much always carries a wound that has not yet been met. And until the wound is acknowledged, the giving becomes compulsive. In my work, I often told my students that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Overgiving is one such fate. It is not chosen. It is enacted. It is not conscious. It is inherited. It is not generosity. It is adaptation, and the soul grows weary of adaptation. When adaptation demands the sacrifice of the inner truth, I want you to imagine another image now, something emerging from the depths of the collective unconscious. Picture a figure made of light, radiant, warm, expansive. This is the empath conscious self. Beside it, almost touching, is a figure made of shadow, dense, potent, full of unexpressed energy. This figure has been trailing behind you for years, waiting to be seen, and one day, as you stand at the threshold of personal exhaustion, the shadow figure reaches out, places a hand on your shoulder, and says, "You cannot continue this way." That voice is not an enemy. It is the self speaking through the shadow. It is the ancient inner intelligence reminding you that your energy is sacred and must not be squandered. When you listen, truly listen to that voice, something extraordinary happens. The people who demanded your energy lose their power over you. The relationships built on imbalance dissolve or transform. The psychic pressure that once pushed you to act compulsively begins to lift. You are no longer the river that floods without direction. You become the river that flows in its rightful course, nourishing everything in its path while maintaining the integrity of its boundaries. What I want to emphasize is that balance is not restored because others change. It is restored because the empath's internal myth changes. For years, the myth has been this: if I give enough, I will be worthy of love. But the new myth is, I am worthy of love even when I give nothing. This shift penetrates to the deepest layers of the unconscious. It changes the narrative. It changes the archetypal script. It changes the very electromagnetic field of the psyche. At this moment, you may feel a subtle tremor in your heart. This is not coincidence. This is resonance. Your psyche knows the truth of what I am saying. It recognizes the ancient echo within your own story. It knows the cost of overgiving. It knows the longing for balance. And so I tell you, when the empath stops overgiving, the psyche inhales again, the breath returns, the soul takes its rightful place. The self smiles from within the depths of the unconscious and whispers, finally. As we continue deeper into this exploration, I want you to sense how the atmosphere around you begins to shift, as if the unconscious itself is leaning closer. listening with an attentiveness that mirrors your own. For whenever we speak of overgiving, we are not discussing a mere behavior, we are touching a psychic wound with ancient roots, intertwined with archetypal patterns that shape the empath's entire orientation toward the world. You must understand that the empath who stops overgiving undergoes a transformation that is almost alchemical. It is as though the prima materia, the raw, unrefined emotional substance, begins to shift into a higher form. In the alchemical texts, the first stage of transformation is nigredo, the darkening, the descent into the shadowed substance of the self. Overgiving often keeps the empath hovering at the threshold of this stage, always giving outward so that they never have to descend inward. But when they finally stop, when they withdraw that outward flowing energy, the descent can begin, and it is in this descent that the transformative fire ignites. You may have noticed this in your own life. When you stop giving excessively, you suddenly feel emotions you have long suppressed. Irritation emerges, grief appears, a strange emptiness surfaces, as though your identity has been woven entirely from threads of service and sacrifice, and without the act of giving, you feel unmoored, untethered. This is the beginning of the alchemical work, the moment when the ego confronts the parts of itself it has been avoiding through overgiving. This is also when the dreams intensify. Many empaths report that during this period, they begin to dream of overflowing rooms, floods, laking vessels, or chaotic gatherings in which they are responsible for holding everything together. These dreams symbolize the psyche's attempt to show the empath how much psychic energy has been spilling outward. Water in dreams always represents emotion. When water is uncontained, the dreamer is giving too much. When water is stagnant, the dreamer is withholding too much from themselves. But when water begins to form rivers, fountains, or flowing streams within natural boundaries, then balance is restored. Watch your dreams during this time. They will speak with a clarity that daily consciousness often lacks. The empath must also confront another truth. Overgiving has often been a disguise for fear. Fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of being perceived as selfish, fear of losing connection, fear of disappointing others. But beneath all these fears lies the most primal one, the fear of facing one's own unmet needs. It is much easier to attend to the needs of others than to gaze into the mirror of one's own deprivation. You see, the empath has learned to witness the suffering of others with exquisite sensitivity, but they have not learned to witness their own suffering with equal compassion. The moment the empath stops overgiving, all the energy once directed outward begins to flow inward. It is like the tide returning to the sea. At first, this inward movement feels unfamiliar, almost frightening, because the empath has built their identity upon the illusion that they must constantly be a source of light for others. It is as though they believe that without their constant emotional labor, the world would collapse into darkness. This is, of course, not true, but the unconscious belief persists until the empath confronts it directly. Let me share with you another symbolic image that often appears in my work. Imagine a torchbearer walking through a dark forest for years. This figure has held the torch outward, illuminating the path for others. But the torchlight never touches their own face. They remain unseen, even by themselves. And one day, the torchbearer grows weary. Their arm trembles, the flame flickers. They finally turn the torch inward, toward their own chest. In that moment, something astonishing happens. The forest around them remains lit. But now the torchbearer sees their own reflection in the polished metal of the torch. They recognize themselves for the first time. This is what occurs when the empath redirects their energy inward. The unconscious begins to reveal the true image of the self. This self-recognition is the crux of individuation. Without it, the empath remains trapped in archetypal roles. The healer, the caregiver, the peacemaker believing these roles define their essence, but these are merely masks, protective but limiting, archetypal but incomplete. The true self cannot emerge while the ego clings to the illusion that its worth depends on its usefulness to others. When the empath stops overgiving, the masks begin to fall away, and beneath them lies a self that is far more expansive, far more complex, far more sovereign than the roles ever allowed. This is why balance is restored instantly, not because circumstances change, but because consciousness changes. The empath realizes that the center of their life has always been located in someone else. Their identity has revolved around others' needs, others' emotions, others' expectations. But the moment they stop overgiving, the center shifts back to where it belongs, the inner self, and when the axis of life returns to the self, harmony emerges as naturally as breath. Yet I must warn you, the world often reacts negatively when an empath stops overgiving. Those who benefited from the imbalance may resist. They may accuse the empath of being cold, distant, selfish, or unkind. But these accusations are projections of their own entitlement. They reveal that the relationship was built not on mutual respect, but on the empath's self-sacrifice. This resistance is not a sign to return to old patterns. It is a sign that the transformation is working. The empath in this phase must hold firmly to their inner truth. They must allow others to experience their own emotional weather without rushing in to rescue them. They must tolerate the discomfort of not being universally liked. They must embrace the fear that arises when they no longer define themselves through giving, and they must learn to trust that their worth is intrinsic, not transactional. As this process unfolds, something extraordinary happens within the psyche. The empath discovers a new source of power, one that does not come from pleasing others or absorbing their emotions. It comes from The shadow, once feared and repressed, becomes an ally. It brings strength, clarity, assertiveness, and instinctive awareness. The empath begins to feel grounded, embodied, capable of saying no without guilt. They develop a sense of inner authority, a rootedness that prevents others from draining their energy. This is not the death of empathy. It is the maturation of empathy. Empathy without boundaries is enmeshment. Empathy with boundaries is wisdom. And now, let me take you further into the symbolic realm. Imagine a vast circular mandala divided into two halves, one half golden, radiant, luminous, the conscious self that gives freely, loves deeply, and understands intuitively. The other half is dark, dense, powerful. The shadow that contains all the qualities the empath has rejected: assertiveness, anger, self-preservation, need, desire, and the capacity for refusal. When the empath overgives, the mandala tilts toward the golden half, becoming lopsided, unstable. But when they stop overgiving, when they reclaim the shadow qualities they once feared, the mandala returns to balance, and in that balance, the self becomes visible. Balance, therefore, is not merely emotional equilibrium, it is the alignment of the conscious and unconscious, the union of opposites, the integration of the inner masculine and inner feminine, the reconciliation of the wounded child and the emerging adult. It is the harmonizing of the archetypal forces that shape the personality. At this stage, the empath often experiences a profound calm, not the fragile calm that depends on others' stability, but a sovereign calm rooted in their own center. They begin to realize that their energy is precious, sacred, and finite. They begin to understand that giving is a choice, not a compulsion. They begin to feel that relationships must be built on reciprocity, not obligation, and they begin to recognize that their sensitivity is not a curse but a gift, one that must be honored, protected, and used wisely. The true miracle occurs when the empath feels, perhaps for the first time, that they do not need to earn love, they do not need to manage the emotions of others, they do not need to sacrifice themselves to maintain harmony, they do not need to be the torchbearer for the entire world. They only need to be themselves fully, authentically, unapologetically. This is the moment when balance is restored instantly, not because the world has changed, but because the empath has remembered who they truly are. As we move deeper now, I want you to sense the subtle shift that happens when the empath finally awakens to the truth of their inner dynamics. It is as if the psyche itself exhales after decades of holding its breath. En ancienne pressure dissolve, the unconscious relaxes its grip, and suddenly the empath finds themselves standing in an inner space they had forgotten existed, a space of clarity, autonomy, and silent strength. This shift does not happen merely at the cognitive level. It is visceral, embodied. The empath feels it in the spine, as though an invisible weight has been removed. They feel it in the chest, where long suppressed emotions begin to circulate again. They feel it in the solar plexus, where the personal will, once buried beneath layers of compliance, begins to glow like an ember awakening in the darkness. This awakening is not a rebellion, it is a return to the self, to the authentic center that has been overshadowed by the compulsive need to pour out more than one has. You see, when the empath stops overgiving, the psychic economy realigns. Energy that once flowed outward uncontrollably begins to circulate within the inner system, nourishing structures that have long been neglected. The inner child, once starved of attention, begins to stir. The inner feminine, once exhausted from tending to everyone else's emotions, begins to rejuvenate. The inner masculine, once silent or collapsed, begins to rise with authority, offering boundaries, structure, and direction. This reorganization resembles the natural world when a drought ends. The land does not remain barren. Life rushes back with astonishing speed. Seeds that lay dormant for years suddenly sprout. Soil that seemed dead reveals its hidden vitality. The psyche is the same. The moment overgiving ends, vitality returns with remarkable immediacy. Creativity blossoms, intuition sharpens, dreams grow more symbolic, richer, deeper. Even the body responds, releasing tension, restoring energy, and rebalancing its rhythms. But let us explore one of the most important inner processes that begins at this stage, the reparenting of the self. Overgiving is often the inheritance of a childhood in which the child had to become the emotional container for a parent. Whether the parent was anxious, wounded, self-absorbed, unstable, or emotionally immature, the child learned to attune outward rather than inward. This creates an internal blueprint that says, my needs are secondary. Their needs come first. If I meet their needs perfectly, perhaps mine will be met someday, but that someday never arrives. When the empath stops overgiving, the child within finally receives the attention it was denied, and this inner child, long ignored, begins to speak. It speaks through sudden waves of emotion, sadness, anger, longing, confusion. It speaks through memories that resurface unexpectedly. It speaks through bodily sensations, tightness in the throat, tremors in the hands, warmth in the heart. These are not regressions, they are revelations. The psyche is revealing what was never allowed to be expressed. The empath, in this moment, must become the parent they never had. Not a perfect parent, but a conscious one, a parent who listens rather than dismisses, who protects rather than sacrifices, who gives rather than demands. And as the inner child begins to trust this newly awakened guardian, an extraordinary thing happens. The compulsion to overgive fades, for overgiving was never about generosity. It was a plea for the love and safety the child never received. Once the child receives this love from within, the need to earn it from others dissolves. This is why balance is restored instantly. The psyche no longer seeks externally what it has finally found internally. Let me illustrate this with another symbolic dream that appears often in the healing journeys of empaths. In this dream, the dreamer stands in a large hall with countless open doors. Behind each door is a person asking for something: help, comfort, validation, attention, emotional labor. For years, the dreamer has walked through every door, attending to every request, but one night, the dream changes. The dreamer finds themselves in the same hall, but now there is a single door illuminated with soft light. When they open it, they do not find another person. They find themselves as a child, sitting quietly on the floor. The child looks up and says, "You finally came back." This dream signifies the ending of the outward search and the beginning of the inward return. And it marks a defining moment in the individuation process, the realization that the inner life must be tended before the outer life can be lived authentically. As the empath continues this inner work, they begin to experience something that may feel unfamiliar, a healthy form of selfishness. This word has been demonized by those who benefit from self-sacrificing individuals. But in psychological terms, a degree of selfishness is essential. It is the foundation of selfhood. Without it, the ego cannot form a stable structure. Without it, boundaries are impossible. Without it, the individual becomes a ghost in their own life, drifting through the emotional needs of others without ever inhabiting their own being. Healthy selfishness does not mean disregarding others. It means remembering oneself. It is the refusal to abandon one's inner world for the sake of external harmony. It is the understanding that true compassion emerges not from depletion but from fullness. An empty cup gives nothing but fragments. A full cup pours naturally without draining the source. At this stage, the empath begins to feel a shift in their relationships. Some relationships deepen, others fall away. The ones that deepen are those built on reciprocity, respect, and genuine care. These relationships welcome the empath's boundaries. They support the empath's transformation. They do not punish or guilt trip the empath for evolving. The relationships that fall away, however, are those that depended on the empath's overgiving. These individuals may become angry, offended, or withdrawn when the empath no longer provides free emotional labor, but their reactions are not the empath's burden, They are the natural consequence of an imbalanced dynamic being corrected. In this shedding process, the empath must trust the intelligence of the psyche. The self does not remove anything that is meant to stay. It clears the path so the individual can walk forward unencumbered. What remains is aligned with the true self. What falls away is aligned with the wounded patterns of the past. As the inner world stabilizes, the empath experiences a new clarity. They begin to see people as they truly are, not as they wish them to be. Overgiving often clouds perception, for the empath projects their own depth onto others. They assume others are as attuned, as caring, as emotionally aware as they are. But once the empath withdraws, their overgiving projection diminishes. They begin to see the narcissist for what they are, the manipulator for what they are, the taker for what they are. And this clarity is not cynical. It is liberating. It allows the empath to make choices based on reality rather than fantasy. At the same time, intuition sharpens. Intuition is the empath's natural gift, but chronic overgiving dulls it. When the empath constantly tunes into others, they lose signal with themselves. But when they return their attention inward, intuition rises like a tide. It becomes a quiet inner voice, a subtle knowing, a sense of direction that feels unmistakably clear. This intuition becomes the empath's compass, guiding them toward relationships, environments, and decisions that nourish their soul. And now we must speak of something even deeper, the activation of inner authority. For years, the empath has outsourced authority to others, parents, partners, friends, societal expectations. Overgiving is often a symptom of this externalized authority. But as the empath withdraws their energy from these external sources and returns it to the inner world, something ancient awakens. A force older than the ego, a voice older than language, the inner authority of the self. This authority is quiet but undeniable. It does not shout, it does not coerce. It simply knows. It knows what is right for the individual. It knows what must be released. It knows what must be pursued. It knows when to act and when to remain still. When the empath stops overgiving, this authority steps forward, and the individual begins to experience a sense of sovereignty they have never felt before. This sovereignty is not dominance, it is autonomy, it is the recognition that one's life belongs to oneself, that one's energy is sacred, that one's emotional labor must not be handed out like alms to anyone who asks, that one's inner world is worthy of devotion. And as this sovereignty grows, the empath begins to feel a profound peace, not the fragile peace that depends on keeping everyone else comfortable, but the deep, grounded peace that comes from living in alignment with one's truth.